Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Berman Institute semi-monthly or bi-weekly symposium seminar. I'm Jeff Kahn. For those of you who don't know me, I'm director of the Berman Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to this week's seminar and to do the honors of the introduction and hosting the rest of today's seminar. I'm going to turn it over to Joe Ali, who is the chair of the Berman Institute Seminar Committee, and he'll do the honors of introducing our speaker today. Joe, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks to my colleagues, Alan Regenberg, Casey Humbert, and Suzanne Knisner, who are also involved with the seminar committee. And we're all thrilled to have our guest speaker today join us all the way from Ghana. So we're hopeful that the internet will hold up. It sounds like it's working well so far, though. But our speaker today is Dr. Cesar Atuire. Cesar is a philosopher and bioethicist at the Department of Philosophy and Classics at the University of Ghana in Legon. He's a visiting faculty as well, fellow at All Souls College at the University of Oxford, and a member of the lead team of the NYU University of Ghana Training Programme in Research Ethics that's funded by the NIH, Fogarty International Center. He was a founding member of Ghana's Research Ethics Consortium. And as a member of the planning committee for the Global Forum on Bioethics and Research in 2020, he was involved with the organization of that meeting. In 2019, some of you may have seen Dr. Atuire's co-edited volume on bioethics in Africa, which focuses on theories and praxis. And his range of philosophical interests, has been a speaker at many international conferences. Those of you who have heard him speak before know that this is going to surely be a very engaging discussion and seminar today. But he has various research interests that engage different issues involving Africa and ethics, including looking at and comparing different normative sources of thinking. And he's carried out research on different frameworks for informing attitudes towards mental health behaviors and as well as suicide in Ghana. And I have to mention this because I think it just speaks to Cesar's character, but he's, in addition to all of that, and everything he does, he's a founder and president of an NGO called Amicus Onulus, and it delivers healthcare to persons in marginalized and rural communities in coastal areas of Ghana. So quite a lot, I know, but we're delighted to have you here with us today, Cesar, to give a presentation titled An African Philosophical Perspective on the Tension Between Autonomy and Solidarity. So thanks again. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Ali, for this great introduction. I mean, it makes me kind of feel a little bit overawed. And thanks really to all the faculty at the John Hopkins Berman Institute for inviting me to this seminar. Particularly grateful to Jeff, to Susan, and all those who have made this possible. I think it's a great occasion to be able to interact with an important institution like yours that is leading a lot of bioethical research and reflection, especially in the current COVID-19 conditions. Today's talk, and let me start sharing my screen. Yeah. Okay. So, is it visible?
It looks good.
Okay, so let me just go to the first slide then. Okay, excellent. So today's talk is it's going to be a little bit rushed because there is a lot to say, and I'd like to make sure that there is time for questions and answers. So we're going to try to tackle this topic about the tension between solidarity and autonomy from a perspective of African philosophy in six steps. And I just want to mention to people who are listening to us that in case there are those who want to follow up on this, I'm always available via email, even to send literature on the references that I'll be using for this particular talk. But in the steps and the overview of this presentation are an introduction and some conceptual clarifications. Then the notion of communality in African philosophy. And then we look at what autonomy and in moral philosophy is all about from this perspective of African philosophy, and some European sources as well. We shall then take up the concept of solidarity, which is quite an ambiguous concept. It's a very wide concept and it is being invoked a lot these days, but we'll take a closer look at solidarity and see how this fits into health and healthcare. And hopefully at the end, I will try to offer a model based on the African vision of solidarity and how this could be applied to the distribution of COVID-19 resources. So let's go, the introduction then. I just wanted to clarify, because this is quite, there is always an objection when you start talking about African philosophy. Africa is a continent made up of over 50 different countries with people who are so different, from Egypt to South Africa, from Somalia to Senegal. And it is very difficult to sort of lump everybody and their different cultures into one notion. However, we do use geographical denominations in philosophy. Just think of continental and analytic philosophy. We talk about, I remember when I was an undergrad in Italy, when we studied empiricism, the title was English empiricism, and then I discovered that Hume was actually a Scot, and that Berkeley was a bishop in Ireland. But these geographical denominations in philosophy tend to be a little bit problematic. However, they are convenient just to allow us to have a bundle which we can talk about. And when we're talking about African philosophy, there is actually diversity within African academic philosophy, which has been going on for well over 80 years now. African philosophy dates back, one may say, even to the Egyptian era, but modern African academic philosophy tends to refer to the work of Placide Tempels in 1948 as perhaps one of the beginning points. And since then, a lot of literature has been generated, and there are differences even of emphasis between the various African philosophers, as we shall see. Two eminent figures like Kwame Gyekye and Ifeanyi Menkiti spent decades actually disagreeing on certain key notions of African philosophy. However, what I'm going to present today is basically identifying some salient and some key concepts that cut across all the different currents, and I present this as an African perspective. Now, one of the things I would like to say is that today there is, at least in bioethics, there is an interest in African perspectives, but there is also a danger. The danger is to see the African perspectives as an add-on, a sort of, exotic, or if I may be informal, a kind of sexy new thing that can add to the global discourse. However, what we're actually talking about is that even given that countries that are supposedly robust in their healthcare systems are facing challenges with regards to applying public health norms and handling the current pandemic, I think it will be necessary to look at other sources of thought in order to broaden the base and perhaps have a better theoretical framework with which to face this. And I think, African philosophy can offer some contributions to the general reflection that is going on around how we can deal with the health challenges that we've been faced with, for example, this year. Now, the topic is about the tension between autonomy and solidarity. It is true that in almost all societies, there is a tension between individual desires, individual aspirations and ambitions, and what society also imposes on the individual. So there is a tension between solidarity, practicing things for the benefit of others, and the individual aspirations. So much so that any child growing up in Ghana is familiar with what we call the Anansi stories. And these are the stories that are used for moral education among children in Ghana. And the stories are all centered around this figure who's supposed to be a spider, the cunning spider, that is always trying to outwit everybody in order to gain, to have self-gain, and yet he always ends up being defeated at the end. Basically, to insist on this idea that if you always pursue your interest at the expense of others, you may seem to succeed temporarily, but you will not be successful in the end. And this shows that even in communities that are very communal, that have a lot of sharing between them, that tension also exists. And there is an Akan proverb, which I have put in here, which says that if you do not allow your neighbor to have 9 or to reach 9, you will not have 10, because the condition of having 10 is that there should be a 9. And so if you are not willing to pursue the interests of other people, you may not even achieve your own goal. However, the interesting and the point I would like to dwell on in this presentation is that when we begin to talk about the tension between autonomy and solidarity, there are ways of looking at it. There is a tension, but this tension can actually be diffused through dialogue and consensus. However, in societies that are heavily adversarial, which as one of the Ghanaian philosophers, Kwesi Wiredu, points out, is a characteristic of partisan politics, sometimes adversarialism makes it difficult to arrive at a consensus. And for that matter, the tension between autonomy or individual aspirations and group aspirations can sometimes be exacerbated. However, today we're going to try and look at a more consensual model within which people can actually express their solidarity and do it in an autonomous manner. Therefore, showing that autonomy is not necessarily always contrary to the practice of solidarity. But before I go, I just want to clarify the terms I'll be using. I'll be referring to communalism. Sometimes in other sources of African philosophy, this is called communitarianism. I prefer to call it communalism. And especially in some circles as well, as soon as the name communalism, communitarian comes in, it begins to evoke concepts of totalitarianism, of communism. This is not what we are referring to. It is interesting that actually the movements that led to the defeat of communist totalitarianism in Central Europe were based on solidarity. We just have to think of Solidarność in Poland, or think of the work of Václav Havel and Jan Potashka in the Czech Republic when they were talking about the solidarity of the shaking. So solidarity can actually be a tool to fight against totalitarianism. And this conception of seeing communalism as a sort of totalitarian or oppressive mechanism is tied to a certain way of thinking, which Kierkegaard, for example, criticized against the Hegelian schools, which is abstract thinking, which is where you take up a notion, for example, the fatherland or the nation, and you abstract it into a reality and subject individuals to it. That is why Kierkegaard was so insistent on the fact that the individual has a place. And the same thing one can see Leopold Senghor, the leader of the current of African thought on négritude, talks about the fact that when we're talking about communalism in the African context, we're not talking about collectivism, which is the idea of individuals coming together as if they are added on. No, here we're talking about something more integral and something more intrinsic. So I just wanted to clarify these concepts before I continue. Now, let's just move to the first part. This is going to be a very, very quick introduction to some of the ideas that are dominant in African philosophy before I then tackle the question of autonomy and the question of solidarity, because these concepts actually form the background to be able to understand the concepts of autonomy and solidarity from an African perspective. One thing that we can say about African thinking is that communality, human communality, is a given. It is a given that has different foundations and different groundings according to the various authors. For example, on an epistemological epistemological level, someone like Tadeusz Metz, who writes from South Africa, talks about the idea that the way an essence of an object is actually defined includes relation. So in defining an object, we do not only look at the constituent elements of that object, which would be the Aristotelian model, whereby the ousia, the essence or the substance, is just made up of what actually constitutes the object that we're trying to define. Here, the category of relation is also important. And for example, just to illustrate with a silly example, we can define water as H2O, which is the constituent element, but then what water means to me as whether I'm a thirsty person or whether I'm looking at the ocean and I do not know how to swim, will define my relationship with water. Therefore, the category of relation is also important when we're trying to define an object. This means that when we're looking at human beings, we're not just trying to define a human being as made up of a body and a soul, a spirit. No, we would also look at that being in its definition, in its relationality. So epistemologically, we're talking about definitions that include relation. Secondly, linguistic approaches to actually understanding the concept of the human person, the notion of the human person. For example, among the Bolsa people in the Savannah region, the Savannah part of Ghana, a human being is simply referred to as a Nurbik, which means the daughter or son of somebody. Therefore, that which defines and gives dignity to a human being is that that being actually matters to someone else. And that person is also a human being. So our dignity, as it were, is derived from the fact that we are relational and we are related and we matter to another being who is also a being, who is also a human being. Then, if we look at the Akan way, the ontological grounding, the Akans, for example, who occupy a larger part of Ghana, will look at the constitutive elements of a human being, where they talk about the okra, which would be like the principle of life. It is often translated as the soul, and the sum, which is translated as the spirit, and the honam, which is translated as the body. Yet, in analyzing each and every one of these elements that actually make up what a human being is, one finds that each of these elements is relational in itself. The okra would refer to the divine spirit. It's like, it's kind of metaphysical spirit that every human being has that goes beyond their physical being. And that being is derived, that element of the okra is derived. For that matter, the human being carries with him a divine spirit and cannot be treated just like any other being. The sum is often sometimes related to the person's character. And this character, of course, comes, in that framework, comes also from the paternal lineage, whereas the honam, which is linked to the blood or the moja, would have a matrilineal line. But the important thing that I'm trying to say is that in the concept of a human being, there is no idea of a human being that is not related. All human beings, just by being human, are relational beings. Now, this idea, which is a descriptive concept of the human being, also informs the normative dimension. Now, the normative dimension means that if this descriptive dimension is supposed to inform the normative dimension, it means that the flourishing of a human being is linked to actually enhancing that relationality of which the human being is constituted. Now, one may criticize this, this particular view by saying that this framework is trying to derive normative conclusions from descriptive conclusions. The idea is this: even if it is not a direct derivation, and there is a work by Oyowe in South Africa on this, even if it is not a direct derivation, But what we're talking about is that the descriptive concept forms the framework, the background within which the normativity is exercised. And this is common to many philosophical currents, where even if we talk about, the Aristotelian framework, for example, the human being is considered as a rational being, and normatively, the high point, the normative ideal, which is happiness, in Aristotle will be considered to be something that is linked to the intellect. So that separation between the normative and the descriptive is not as net as some would like to imagine it anyway. And therefore, in this framework, what we do see is that normativity is linked to our communal aspects and the communal aspects of our lives. And in this sense, there are differences between African philosophers. For example, Ifeanyi Menkiti would give some degree of precedence and ontological precedence to the community, whereas Jeche talks about a moderate communism, a moderate communitarianism, within which the community actually exists for the benefit of the individual. From this viewpoint, what we can say is that, from Kwame Jeche's moderate communitarian viewpoint, there is an account saying that actually illustrates the point very well. It says that when a human being descends from the heaven, it descends into a community. And the community is like a cluster of trees. It's like a forest. Seen from afar, it looks like a bundle huddled together. But once you get close to it, you see that it is made up of individual trees. So the normative concept is actually linked to the fact that we are communitarian beings. And there is also another aspect of the African philosophical notions of personhood that I would like to point out before I move on. Because the communitarian dimension is so important, we do see a sort of distinction between the moral status of being human, which is derived from our ontological status. I call that an object moral status, which all human beings have. There is also a normative aspect linked to our morals, a subjective aspect linked to our moral personhood, which is derived from the fact that people engage more, and as you engage more and you promote human good, your moral standing actually grows. And for that matter, you would see that in some African philosophical writings, you would see things like personhood actually growing and evolving over time. Because it is believed, and Menkiti, for example, holds this opinion that older people and people who are more engaged in the community have a greater moral standing and a greater normative personhood than persons who tend to be individualistic. Even though persons who tend to be individualistic are not totally deprived of their humanity. So you have a progressive and evolving normative conception of personhood and moral standing here. Now, one might say this is similar to other frameworks where you can talk about communitarianism, as in the works of Sandel or in the works of Charles Taylor and other communitarian philosophers. The interesting thing about the African approach is that the idea of a human being being an individual without relations who then enters into relationships does not exist, because the atom, the atomic view of the human person doesn't exist. That person doesn't exist. Any person in the act of being is already coming into being in a relational context. And therefore, the idea of an individual that is totally divorced of all other relations is actually a figment of our intellectual projections, because that doesn't exist. That is how this framework, that is what this framework actually represents. Therefore, the communality is a given. And it is in enhancing this communality that a person grows from the normative dimension. Now, we look at autonomy. This very, very rapid presentation of the African philosophical ideas. But I just want us to look at autonomy because, I mean, especially today, when we start discussing some of the public health measures from wearing masks to, you know, accepting or not accepting a vaccine and, you know, obeying rules of lockdown and all these things come into place, many people invoke the notion of autonomy and the freedom of choice, which should be respected, and therefore public health measures cannot actually impose or impede their freedom. Now, let's look at what, I mean, a little bit of the history of autonomy in moral philosophy. I mean, this is something that would require almost a series of about 6 or 7 lectures, but I'm going to try and say what I have to say in a few minutes. You know, in the first place, autonomy, we're talking about autos nomos. So it is self-rule, giving rules to yourself. That is what autonomy is about. Now, giving rules to yourself, the rules are based on something. And this is something that is sometimes forgotten when we're talking about autonomy. Now, if we go back, we see that one of the greatest promoters of moral autonomy is Immanuel Kant. But Immanuel Kant fits into a tradition of thought, European thought, that actually arrives at that concept of moral autonomy. Now, these are many centuries of philosophical thinking. But then if we look at the Greek ideal, at least as we find it in the Nicomachean Ethics, where the idea of eudaimonism is important, which is, you know, eudaimon, which is the realization of our daimon, the realization of our destiny, our spirit, or whatever, because as you know very well, the concept of daimon is open to various interpretations within Greek philosophy. But it is the self-realization, which sometimes we translate in modern language as happiness or as flourishing. Now, the Greek ideal had a few, I mean, the Greek framework had a few limitations, and one of the limitations was the question of obligation, because the Aristotelian ethical structure is a teleological structure, whereby Aristotle actually believes that human beings have a nature, and it is in realizing this nature through virtue that we become happy. But that doesn't ground obligation. Why do we have to actually follow our nature? And it is in this context that when Christianity emerged in Europe, Christianity latched onto this weakness by introducing the idea of a divine will, which to some extent it becomes the center of obligation. And this becoming the center of obligation leads to a heteronomous moral structure, which means a moral structure that actually depends on something that is outside. That is why it is heteronomous. And being heteronomous, it means that morality is then grounded on faith, on principles of faith, and in Christianity, above all, in the Decalogue. Now, what Kant was trying to do was to say that no, we can actually create a moral system which is based not on principles that are derived from outside, but principles that are derived from rational deliberation. And therefore, we need to eliminate a heteronomic moral framework and have an autonomous moral framework. But this autonomous moral framework is not just a question of choice without any restrictions. Kant talks about rational deliberation. And even in the formulation of the categorical imperative, Kant requires that we universalize, as if what we're about to do would become a universal law. And in so doing, that the categorical imperative becomes actually linked to the fact that this is something that would be good for society. And for that matter, our deliberation, our rational deliberation in autonomy is not divorced from other people. So invoking autonomy as if it were an individualistic prerogative is not what Kant actually foresaw. However, we also see that, yes, it is true that at least in Anglo-Saxon philosophy, there have been certain currents that have led to this particular view of, autonomy as individual choice. One just has to think of Bentham's, Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, where Jeremy Bentham talks about the community as a fictitious body that is composed of the individuals who are considered as constituting it as members. So the community really does not exist, it's a fictitious body. Or we can talk about, Hobbes, where basically the constitution of society in the natural state is of conflict, of war against, war of all against all. Or John Locke, who has a more moderate vision, but the moderate vision is based on self-interest, whereby the individual enters into contract with society in order to obtain these interests. But the individual is constituted and then enters into contract. Now, this is not necessarily the view that Kant had, but this is the view that perhaps some schools of thought that are actually promoting autonomy tend to hold these days. However, there are also, even in the European tradition, other expressions of affirming the individual, but also in a solidaristic way. And we find this especially among the French existentialists. Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, in trying to justify existentialism, when existentialism was being criticized as just a fad of young Parisians, tried to explain that actually in making a choice, when he's talking about the authentic choice, we are actually wishing that the world were this way. And therefore, even our individual choices, which are authentic, are a reflection of what we think the world should be. And therefore, they do have a kind of universal and other-looking perspective. And then, of course, the great Albert Camus, who in L'Homme Révolté, when he talks about the absurd and rebellion, Albert Camus actually says that the act of revolt, of rebelling, is an affirmation that is implicit in every act of revolt, is something that transcends the individual and withdraws the individual from solitude, because Albert Camus, the philosopher of the absurd, talks about life being an absurd, which is basically the search for meaning and the absence of meaning, and the response to that is to revolt or rebellion. But in affirming this rebellion, we are actually transcending ourselves, and therefore it is not just a question of authenticity as just an individual conquest that hasn't got any contact with other people. But on the African, from the African perspective, the idea of autonomy and solidarity actually seem to tie together. Because in the Ubuntu circles, for example, Ramose will talk about the fact that we become persons through other persons. Or Kwame Gyekye, invoking from the Akan tradition, talks about humanity not having any boundaries, and the fact that we do need a community in order to be able to thrive. And also we have Kwesi Wiredu, who has this expression that Onipa no here, which is the human being is that which is needed and that which is of value. And here, one of my colleagues at the University of Ghana, Professor Martin Ajay, has done a lot of work in trying to explain that the human being is the only being that is actually of value, and this is also needed. And every human being needs human beings, and every human being should find other human beings as beings of value. And this is what leads to Wiredu's conception of ethics, a sympathetic impartiality, but there is, an idea of actually harmonizing our different needs in order to create a society that will promote the human flourishing of every one of its members. At the end of the day, the African perspective, to summarize it on autonomy and its communitarian dimensions, can be summarized in the following way. What we're looking at is that, yes, the human being is autonomous because we can actually make choices and decide. But if those choices are authentic to who we are as relational beings, those choices will also lead towards a solidaristic behavior. And therefore, manifesting solidarity is not necessarily opposed or antithetical to actually practicing autonomy. Let's move on to solidarity. Solidarity is a concept that would require quite a lot to be able to sort of like explain. And it is interesting that the word solidarity has become more commonly used this year. If you go into Google and do Google Analytics, you'll find that from March to April, there was almost a peak in people searching for the word solidarity. And then sometime also after the resurge of the Black Lives Matter movement, you see another surge in people searching for solidarity. Now, what is solidarity? I'm going to try to start from a working definition that was offered by Prensak and Barbara Prensak and Elena Bui, and I would perhaps even add some suggestions to that particular definition, but I think it is a working definition that we could start off, we could use to start off with. This working definition says solidarity in its most elementary form is an enacted commitment to carry the costs, financial, social, emotional, and other contributions of assisting others with whom a person or persons recognize similarity in a relevant aspect. Now, just a few elements on this definition, and then I will continue. The first thing I would like to underline is the fact that solidarity is an active commitment. It's not just empathy, it's not just sympathy. Two, this idea of assisting others and sharing the cost, the definition says to carry the cost, I say to share the cost, stems from a we-ness. When there is a solidary group, there is a sense of we-ness. We belong together, we belong to this group. And failures and successes seem to be shared among the members of the group. This derives from even the original Roman legal use of the word solidarity, which was obligatio in solidum, whereby members of a group, a clan, a family could be held responsible to pay the debts of another person because they are believed to be people who share the benefits of that particular debt. Now, there are a few distinctions, and the type of solidarity I'm going to concentrate on here is solidarity amongst, because there is also in the English language the use of solidarity towards, whereby one can actually practice some form of solidarity towards other people, but it is always other people. That type of solidarity is aspirational. Here we're talking of a solidarity that is more committed, is enacted, and actually has normative dimensions, and that is solidarity amongst. Now, that solidarity amongst is grounded above all on similarities that we recognize with the people with whom we are sharing. This is unlike some charitable models which tend to insist on the difference. So let's help the poor because they are so poor and they are suffering. No, we are part of the problem. And this is another human being like me who is going through a period of suffering when we're talking about the poor. And for that matter, allowing other humans to go through this form of loss of dignity is also an affront to my dignity. And that is where we practice solidarity amongst. Now, there are many other elements that I've listed here, but I'm going to jump them. I just want to talk about the minimum threshold rule of solidarity groups. Now, solidarity doesn't guarantee equality amongst members. Just think of religious groups that practice a lot of solidarity. Religious groups tend to be very hierarchical. Yet at the same time, solidarity has a sort of minimum threshold whereby in a solidary group, members of the group are not allowed to fall, or the group does not allow members to fall beneath that threshold. And they will do everything to protect other members. We think of trade unions, they will do everything to protect the work, the possibility of members to be able to work. And this is also linked to dignity, and incidentally, in the Ubuntu circles, for example, when we're talking about human dignity and we're talking about solidarity, the word that is used, Obumwe, is the same thing as solidarity. Now, I'm going to have to I think I have, how many more minutes? Let me just see, about 5 or 8 minutes,
Yeah,
5 or 6
see,
minutes.
5 to 10 minutes, yeah, thank you.
5 to 10 minutes, so let's try and bring this together then. So let's look at healthcare, healthcare and solidarity. So far what we have said is that the human being is a relational being, practicing and enhancing our common humanity is something that requires solidarity and something that we can carry out autonomously. How does this affect health? The concept of health, at least in many African contexts, is a broad concept. Here we have Badejisin, for example, taken from the Yoruba concept, talks about health as alafia, or the Hausa language, they use lafia, which talks about our well-being in our physical state and our well-being in our relations with other people and other members of the community. Therefore, health is not only just biophysical well-being, it is also psychological, it is social, it is metaphysical, because it fits into a larger cosmological framework. Therefore, when we begin to talk about health, public health is very important in this context. It is not just a question of biomedical treatment of illness. And Badejisin goes even to talk about disease, where he actually breaks down the word disease into dis and ease. And therefore, disease is when a person is ill at ease, he's diseased, right? And therefore, in facing and in addressing questions of health, we need to have this broader vision. It is holistic, it's socio-relational, it is also metaphysiological. Now, who are the duty, when we talk about healthcare, right? Healthcare and rights and duty bearers in healthcare. And here I'll just jump quickly. Anybody who is familiar with the West African context knows that markets are very important. Not only are they places where people buy and sell, but they're also places where people socialize and meet. Now, on market days, everybody goes walking towards the market. And there is a saying among the Bolsa people that if you are looking for a therapy for your condition, go and sit by the road that leads to the market. Because as people pass by and they're going towards the market, they will stop and they will offer you advice, they will offer you suggestions, they will offer you assistance. Which this idea means that we are all duty bearers of the right to health, because health is what promotes our common humanity. And therefore, when we're talking about health, it necessarily becomes both an individual and a communal good. And therefore, healthcare requires solidarity. It requires sharing among members of a group, members of a community. And in this particular case, we're talking of our common humanity, because healthcare is right at the base of what it is to be human. Without health, we can die, and when we die, we do lose our humanity. Therefore, the minimum threshold when we're talking about healthcare and solidarity would be that of saving lives, and that becomes the priority. Whatever we can do to avoid preventable deaths is of utmost importance. Now, how does this fit into a model of distribution of scarce healthcare resources in COVID-19? As you know, now there are many models that are being suggested to distribute diagnostics, PPEs, or distribute therapeutics, or to distribute vaccines. And most of these models sometimes, for example, are based on the model promoted by Ezekiel Manuel and others, based on the idea of SAIL, the standard expected years of life lived, in order to be able to calculate the allocations on an international level and all that. All the models are interesting. There are those who are talking about ensuring that 20% of a population of every country, even low-income countries, have access to the vaccine, but to a future vaccine. However, if we try to look at, let's say, in-country distribution of these resources. And we're talking of, let's say, a critical phase of the pandemic and in-country distribution of resources, for example, of vaccines, using this solidarity model. How would we go about it? And this is a suggestion of a model that I just want to throw and maybe throw out there in some of the discussion later on, we'll be able to look at it. If we are a group that admits and accepts solidarity as the basis, which means that we are all linked together and our health and well-being is tied together, then the minimum threshold that we need to establish is that preventable deaths should be avoided, because anybody who falls beneath that minimum threshold actually falls out of the community. Therefore, if we are looking for prioritization of distribution of resources, then the most vulnerable should be the first people to receive, for example, vaccines. If we're talking about this translated, for example, would be people living with underlying conditions that put them at a higher risk of mortality in case of infection of COVID-19. We're also talking about older persons. And I mean, this is not just based on the fact that in Africa, older persons are federated, and for that matter, most Africans would find it unacceptable that older persons can actually be deprived of resources in favor of younger people. Now, the idea is this: if they are the most vulnerable, then in order to ensure that they do not fall beneath that minimum threshold, which we have established as a group in solidarity, means that they have a high priority. Second, we also need to ensure that persons who are offering essential services for the community to be able to discharge its duties towards every individual are also taken care of. And even in applying that principle of essential workers or persons who are necessary for the community to be able to discharge its services towards the individuals, we can still even apply within that category those, a kind of selection of those who are most at risk. Therefore, essential workers with underlying conditions will even have a priority over essential workers who can find other means of protecting themselves, for example, using PPEs, compared to those who are really at risk because of their health conditions. And then the third category that one would like to, that one would attend to within this framework would be people who are potential super spreaders, because these are persons who enter into contact with a vast number of people. When I think of the West African context, I think of people using public transport. And here, public transports are made up of small minibuses, and you have drivers and drivers' assistants, we call them drivers' mates, who daily enter into contact with more than 500 to 1,000 people per day on a good day. Or people who are market sellers, who sell in the market, who have to meet people all the time. These are people we know that when infected, and if not detected, these people can actually become super spreaders, and these will also have a priority. The interesting thing about this framework that I just want to mention is that, as you can see, it is based on solidarity, based on trying to ensure that no member of the community actually falls beneath the threshold. And it is not an institution-centered model. Institution-centered models would tend to divide quickly into categories. I remember in the UK, when the pandemic broke out, the idea was, let's save lives, let's defend the NHS. So the priority is to defend an institution and save lives as well. This is important. However, even within the idea of defending institutions, it is more important actually to save lives, because at the end of the day, the institutions exist in order to save lives. And this is moderate communitarianism, because yes, one upholds the importance of institutions, but the institutions are only functional to promoting our common humanity and our human values. I think, I mean, I will stop here, but what I've been trying to say is that, yes, it is normal for there to exist tension between individual aspirations and communitarian or communal aspirations. However, the practice of solidarity can actually stem out of a desire, an autonomous desire reflected to live our humanity. And in the African philosophical framework, which I have presented, the flourishing of a human being actually lies in practicing this form of solidarity autonomously. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Atuire. That was a very thought-provoking talk, and we have about 10 minutes or so, I think, for questions and discussion. So let me just, in the interest of time, open up the floor. And we have a few questions in the comment here in the chat box, and maybe Travis, if it's all right, I'll ask you to maybe share your comments verbally here. Hopefully you're able to do so, and maybe Suzanne, if
I think I was able to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
That was so fantastic. Thank you for sharing with us. My question came early, and I think it's actually quite likely that we heard the answer about 10 minutes after. But you were commenting on what it sounded like you were calling the linguistic approach, and gave a comment that was something like, the dignity of the human depends on the shared concern of other humans. And so before you got to, you know, the next 10 minutes, my immediate question was, could you be kind of orphaned from humanity? You know, you live in the woods with your family and they're all killed and no one else knows that you exist and you stay in the woods. Do you lose your dignity because you're kind of orphaned or cut off from humanity? Or is this linguistic conception taken to be more kind of generic?
Actually, there is, now I didn't have enough time to go into that. Thanks very much for the question. The particular group I'm referring to, the Bulsa people, have an answer for that in one of their sayings. Their saying is that God takes care of, God is the father of orphans. So that makes sure that nobody really is excluded. That's the way they say it. And secondly, when we are referring to this idea of actually being in relation with another person, in this particular framework, if we look at it broadly, that those other persons need not be living persons. You know, many African frameworks also include the ancestors in the community. And so it is actually implausible that a human being can exist without any relation.
Very cool. Thank you so much. Absolutely, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me also see if Nancy Jecker, if you're still on and would like to speak and share your questions, we can unmute you as well. Let me see. Let's try this. Can you speak now?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, Dr. Atuire. You spoke a lot about solidarity, and I'm wondering if you could do two things. One is distinguish the sub-Saharan African conception of solidarity from the European notion of solidarity. How are they similar? How are they different? And then also, when you elaborated solidarity, you indicated it referred in some respects to not falling beneath the minimal threshold of human capabilities. And I'm wondering how the sub-Saharan African conception of solidarity relates to capability theories of justice.
Great. Okay, thanks Nancy. Okay, thanks. Good to hear your voice. The sub-Saharan grounding is linked to the fact that solidarity is not optional. It is grounded in our being. I think, I mean, you're familiar with the notion of black tax. Even today on the BBC, they're discussing this whole idea of black tax, where people who are well off in the community are expected to help other people, full stop. So for some of us, for example, when it comes to schools to reopen, we're always scared because you will receive a phone call from a very distant relative or distant person you met whom you do not know that is going to ask you to help them with school fees for their wards, right? There is that idea that it is a given. Whereas the European movements of solidarity, we see that they are born, I mean, the sources of, we can talk about three sources. One of the sources are sometimes shared experiences, whereby, especially with the workers' movements, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the creation of a new proletariat, the workers, through a shared experience, come together to create movements of solidarity. Then we also have, I mean, institutional solidarity, whereby in some of the Northern European countries, the whole tax system, for example, even healthcare systems, assumes solidarity, and therefore you pay high taxes, but the state actually delivers the services to you, and it becomes an institutional source. So there are various, sources of solidarity. The sub-Saharan African experience or vision of solidarity does not even rely on the sources of the lived experience, but it takes it as an assumed. This is the way it is to be human. Then the capabilities theory, I think, I mean, there is a lot of similarities here. I haven't done specific work on Sen and Nussbaum's, I mean, capability theory from a viewpoint of, I mean, of solidarity. I think that is work that perhaps, I mean, I would need to do, or if you want, we can do.
Thank you. So let me see if we have two or three other questions. We might not be able to get to all of them, but let me ask if Rachel, if you're interested, we can unmute you as well, and you can share your question here. So please go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Rachel and I'm a postdoc. I wanted to ask you, how can institutions be held accountable for promoting their individual citizen solidarity using a person-centric model? And maybe this is only applicable in Western contexts where this is more of a question that needs to be asked, but in any case.
How can institutions be held accountable? Now, solidarity requires trust, right? Especially between institutions and citizens or members of a community. Now, here I may have to borrow from Honora O'Neill, Cambridge. Honora O'Neill talks about, how do we build trust? And she says it's not abstract, it's about building trustworthy persons and trustworthy institutions. And there are perhaps three characteristics that she identifies in order to be able to do this. One is to be competent. So the institutions have to be competent in delivering what they are supposed to deliver. Two, they have to be reliable. So what they say, you know that they're going to actually do it. And three, and I think this is the most important aspect, is that the institutions should make themselves vulnerable, which means they should make themselves available to be challenged and to be questioned. Now, the various mechanisms for doing this will depend also on the political context in which one lives. There are ways of doing this, from civil actions to the extremes of even demonstrations. It depends on the context, but institutions have to make themselves vulnerable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think unfortunately we're at the top of the hour. but when we have a couple of more lingering questions, but we'll be able to take note of them, I think, and maybe leave them as food for thought. But let me just thank you, Dr. Atuire, again for joining us at Johns Hopkins today. And on behalf of everyone, we'd love to have you back anytime. Thank you.
Great. It's been